Good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad, Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's start with news that Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced that Russia has become the first country to grant regulatory approval to a COVID-19 vaccine. And this is after less than 2 months of human testing. So Moscow has likened its success to the space race. And so this newly approved coronavirus vaccine will be called Sputnik 5. This is in homage to the Soviet Union's Cold War era satellite program. Now, Russian officials have said that they plan to start mass vaccination in October. The vaccine, however, has not yet completed its final trials, and Russia's announcement to grant this approval before then it's raised some concerns among health experts. But Putin is saying that the vaccine has passed all the required checks and that even his daughter has already been given it. So the question is whether Putin's assurances are going to be enough, Sharaad, to convince the international community.
Well, Melisa, I mean, it goes back to some really, I think, problematic optics and, you know, calling it Sputnik 5 and invoking the Cold War era, a time in which superpower rivalry was really about a kind of, you know, inflated nationalism, and nothing in some ways it was about the science of it. And I think in the case of COVID-19, people are looking for the scientific community to lead the discussion and not necessarily politicians whose interests might be nationalistic. And
particularly, I think also the lack of transparency around the data. I think perhaps having, you know, the data be made public about the results of the trial could help, I guess, you know, allay some concerns about the efficacy of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Vaccine. Because when we talk about politicians, you know, leading as a and you know, and we compare that to say scientists. Scientists have protocols. They have a system of peer review. All the test results, and we know there's some proprietary knowledge here. And you know, of course, you know, big pharma is interested in making profits, and so that aside, the scientific community is driven by very high standards. Politicians are driven by short-term gains, and this, I think, is a very problematic scenario.
But you know what? I think not everyone has those concerns. There are some countries that are already buying in or placing orders for this, being ahead of production. And I'm just wondering how Malaysia is going to respond, and how we want our policymakers, our decision makers, to respond to this. Do we want to jump on the bandwagon and place an order with Russia for this vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, placing orders, you know, ahead of everybody else, I mean, that's being done already for a range. I mean, so there's kind of a hedging your bets kind of
and
logic.
There's so many possible vaccines.
Absolutely, Melisa. You know, the question is really, is this the one? And for policymakers, local policymakers and politicians, we want them to be asking the tough questions. They're going to be spending public monies. Are they going to be asking tough questions of the Russians? And there's no reason to be skeptical that Russia could have developed it first. I mean, I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that having developed it, you know, has there been enough safety sort of wired into the system? And is that up for public scrutiny, at least by peers within the scientific community?
Exactly. All right. Well, in other news, earlier this week, a video went viral in which a man revealed the location of an illegal gambling activity in Sungai Buloh, claiming that the police have not yet taken any action in the matter, alluding to allegations of police protecting the gamblers. Now we hear of news that that man in the video, Muhammad Asri Hamid, better known by his screen name Asri Janggut, he's now being investigated by police for allegedly insulting the Royal Malaysian Police and the Malaysian Armed Forces. Now, I think that's particularly interesting. You know, I wonder whether it might have a chilling effect on people who may want to come out and, you know, expose any kind of wrongdoings. Whether this might mean, you know, it might feel like a crackdown towards this.
Well, I think, you know, it'd be very clear that, you know, these two things was very, you know, they were separate and issues, right? So you have the question of the gambling death, for which the police have been responsive, and I think that's good. And it also demonstrates how civic engagement and public involvement actually will help stem corruption within institutions like the police. And I'm sure the police are grateful for that. Well, the issue really here with his insult is that he seems to have, perhaps in the exuberance of the moment, gone on to say things that were actually quite unfair. I mean, he was casting doubt about the piety of individuals within the police force.
Standing. Again,
yeah, not moral standing, but their piety, whether they actually pray, right?
Yeah, okay.
So should he have said that? And if he, and I believe he's apologized, Melissa, does that mean, should we now close the books on this?
Well, okay, so you're absolutely right. And I think that at the heart of the matter here is, ensuring that there are kind of channels for kind of open communication with the public. So the public has wants to make a complaint about wrongdoings or things that they have observed or want to expose. There should be, we should welcome those kinds of considerations, those kinds of, the information, because, again, the idea of, and I think one of the ministers has said that, you have to do this according to the official channels or the right channels. And in the age of social media, in the age of this democratization of information, I don't know what those right channels are.
Well, I mean, they are right channels, but the question is whether those who are now calling for right channels are being too bureaucratic.
Right.
I mean, the question is, in the spirit of openness and engagement, do you want to be insisting that the I's are dotted and the T's crossed on everything, rather than saying, what is the reason that this individual has come out to the public and made this complaint? And with that, really taking it forward. So, saying, well, are there proper channels? I mean, these are things that authoritarians often say because they want to constrain precisely the democratization of public life in Malaysia.
Well, on that note of the gambling issue, I believe the latest news is that Buletin is investigating the alleged misconduct of these officers and policemen in the Sungai Buloh IPD. So that's something that the police are looking into. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. And after this, we'll turn our attention to Beirut and the consequences of that devastating explosion that killed 200 people and injured thousands. That's all coming up in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned to Consider This.
COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
COVID-19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over. We need to be vigilant to keep ourselves and others safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and when you're out, keep a safe distance. In fighting this virus, we can't relax, so don't be lax.
We all know the war against COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
COVID-19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's turn our attention to Lebanon, where earlier this week the government resigned following days of protests. Now, this was after more than 200 people were killed and thousands injured or left homeless in that devastating blast at Beirut's port. The tragedy came at a time when Lebanon was already facing political, economic and public health crises. So to help us further understand the consequences of that horrific explosion and the worsening political situation there, we have on the line Guy Burton. He's the adjunct professor at Vesalius College in Brussels, where he teaches global governance. Guy, thank you so much for joining us on the line tonight. Now, in late last year, Lebanon was convulsed by anti-government protests for the economic misery that the population was suffering. Now, I'm wondering whether the anger over the blast was the final straw that, figuratively broke the back of Prime Minister Diab's government.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show, Melisa and Sharaad. I appreciate it. Yes, I mean, I think the important thing to make about all of this is that the current protest, the current anger that you're seeing in Lebanon is not because of the blast. It was already happening. And it was a number of different things that are going on there, both political and economic crises, which are all compounding and playing in towards each other. It's worth keeping in mind, of course, that there have been previous rounds of political mobilization of protests. Whether this is actually going to be the one that, as you say, breaks the camel's back, it remains to be seen. If you look, for example, back in 2015, for example, there was a mass protest movement, frustration at, sort of the inability of governments to provide public services like rubbish collection. And that even led to sort of the emergence of a new political party, but it hasn't really replaced the system as it currently stands.
Yeah, I understand in 2015 that was called the garbage uprising. I know last year's was referred to as the October uprising. What is that at the heart of the problem? If people are protesting not against specific governments but against the establishment as a whole, what is it that they want change? So the protest movement is quite wide-ranging, and it's very clear what it's against. The difficulty, of course, is going to be, forming some kind of organization and sort of political coalition out of it. Politically, they're very frustrated at the nature of the political system and of the political parties, which don't seem to be very representative anymore, which seem to operate in their own kind of elite silo. Then, of course, economically, the development model has pretty much broken down. Lebanon isn't really producing enough. It's not really generating enough revenues, which has created problems in terms of sort of fiscal deficit. And as a result, successive governments have been spending more than they're earning. And then compounded on top of all of this as well, Lebanon is facing a major crisis in the presence of large numbers of refugees. I mean, it's around a quarter of the Lebanese population is now people from Palestine, from Syria, who have fled wars, and of course the government is having to provide support to them.
Okay. Well, Guy, Diab himself said that he knew corruption was rampant in the country, that he, couldn't move forward with certain reforms due to obstructions from other political stakeholders. I'm wondering, are you sympathetic at all to these claims?
Yeah. So, I mean, you have a political system which has become pretty much sort of sclerotic. It's become fossilized. I mean, it emerged in sort of the wake of the Civil War, in which the different factions were kind of frozen. And in a way, it sort of worked to the detriment, to the benefit of those at the top. Those warlords, those generals, those military leaders became political leaders, and their relatives have kind of perpetuated it. And it generally tends to be sort of an arrangement where they share the spoils, and if you're close to their particular faction, of course you get sort of benefit out of that. But of course that has sort of become disconnected from wider society, which has been sort of cut off from all of that.
So what happens now in the wake of the resignation of the government? Are people satisfied? Are they going to press on? I mean, what is the political culture in the larger Lebanon and Beirut in particular that we might actually be seeing over the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, so the government has resigned, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have elections automatically. What looks likely to happen is that the political class will try and sort of find, you know, a new prime minister and then a new government. But keep in mind, of course, the one that just resigned was only put in place 6 months ago, you know, having sort of fallen in the wake of the protest that began in October. You'll find that people on the protest side are still, you know, they only see this as one step. You know, this isn't the end. They want to see, you know, mass change of the political system. Whereas I think, you know, those within the political system, those within the existing political parties, want to sort of just make a chop and change and hopefully continue on as before.
So what is it that the Lebanese want changed, Guy? I mean, beyond just the political system.
Yeah, so there's a number of things that are sort of emerging from the protest movement. You know, as I flagged up, you know, there are political demands, you know, sort of a more responsive political system, but then also economically, there is frustration at the inability of the government to, you know, to provide the kinds of jobs and services and income, you know, that people need. You know, unemployment is high. You know, there has been a mass financial crisis over the last, you know, year in which people have been unable to take out their money. You know, this is really, you know, affecting society. We're now at a stage where almost half of the Lebanese population is falling under the poverty line. So there is mass frustration and dissatisfaction with the direction that the country is heading in.
Guy, you know, are there civil society or political movements that are emerging now that are not linked to the old players, that are based on confessional lines, you know, Muslim, Christians, Druze, all these kinds of traditional configurations for political mobilization? Are there new ones emerging?
Yes, so, you know, really it's still the case that the bulk of the political parties tend to sort of follow this kind of sectarian line. That said, as you flagged up, the garbage movement in 2015 did see the emergence, you know, of a more non-sectarian, you know, sort of cross-societal political party. But it was primarily running at municipal elections, and it hasn't really broken through yet. And this is one of the big challenges, and it's also worth keeping in mind Lebanon as part of the wider Middle East picture here. You know, the political protests, the frustrations with the economic outlook for the country, this is not something that's unique to Lebanon. You know, this has been going on across the wider region, you know, for much of the last 10 years. It's the origins of the Arab uprising. And in Lebanon, the similar sort of thing is happening here. You know, people are dissatisfied with the political and economic direction. The problem is, of course, is that, you know, there is a lot of mobilization, but it hasn't necessarily manifested itself in, you know, viable alternatives in terms of new political parties and vehicles to replace the old elite.
Well, Guy, can we get you to stay on the line? I want to continue this conversation with you in just a couple of minutes. We're going to take a quick break, so stay tuned to consider this, folks. We'll be right back.
COVID-19 is still on. It is our responsibility to adhere to all the regulations set by our Ministry of Health. We are in the era of a new norm. Face masks, social distancing, and also hand hygiene are just basics. We can do this together, and let's not take it easy.
COVID-19 is still out there. Let's do our part in following the SOPs in place so that we can break the transmission. Follow the 3 C's. Avoid closed conversations, avoid crowded spaces, and avoid confined spaces. We can beat this together.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing of the face mask. It's a new norm. Let's not slack. We can do this.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over.
Hi, thanks for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Guy Burton about Beirut. Now, Guy, French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Beirut just 2 days after that horrific blast attracted a lot of attention. In fact, he was on the streets of Beirut even before Lebanon's Prime Minister was. Now, since then, there's been a petition demanding to, quote, place Lebanon under French mandate for the next 10 years. Guy, is anyone taking this petition seriously? Are the French taking this petition seriously?
I think that's a quite contentious thing to talk about. I mean, I don't think, the idea that the French are going to come back as the mandate power is not something that I think, is particularly welcome within the wider Lebanese society. I mean, certainly the point to be made is that Macron was one of the first ones on the scene. But I think, that sort of what his presence there has done has to sort of flag up the point that the international community is watching to see what is going to happen within Lebanon. And the questions are now being asked as to, what is Lebanon going to do next?
Guy, I mean, people are also, at least some observers, are also skeptical about this kind of savior attitude that the French might take, and some maybe French intellectuals might take with regard to Lebanon. I mean, aren't the French and some of the superpowers, in fact, who are playing politics in Lebanon also to blame?
Absolutely. I mean, the way that the French, what's happening with regards to sort of, France is that, they have sort of drawn attention to, the issue of what's going on in Lebanon. And certainly, this has also helped, Macron, sort of deflect from his own sort of domestic challenges and problems. I mean, here in Europe, we're facing difficulties with, balancing, the public health issues regarding COVID-19 with, the economy sort of trying to provide, sustainable jobs and that sort of thing. So this is useful for Macron in terms of sort of looking away from what's going on at home. That said, within what's happening with the international community is going to be really important. Lebanon has recently been, sort of in talks with the IMF about getting a loan in order to help ease its financial crisis. But it's been proving very, very difficult because, the Lebanese have not agreed to the proposed reforms that the IMF is suggesting that they need to undertake.
Well, guys, speaking about the international community watching, I mean, there's been some donor money that's been pledged, and that money is said to be contingent on reforms being implemented. Now, my question is that a good idea to kind of pledge donor money to rebuild Beirut after this horrific explosion, to ensuring structural changes are implemented?
Yeah, so that is somewhat awkward in sort of, in demanding, reforms and change in order for, aid, for reconstruction of what is a tragic blast. That said, it's important to keep in mind that this, the humanitarian assistance and the monies that are being pledged, it's important to keep in mind that this was not a natural disaster, right? This was a man-made disaster. It was building up to something like this. So it's important that the international community does not let, sort of the Lebanese government off the hook on this. And you've seen that with regards to, sort of Macron saying, that he would like to see an independent inquiry. And that has created a bit of consternation within Lebanon, certainly amongst the political ruling class, who fear that anything that's independent, anything that's international would draw attention, to them and put them on the spot.
Guy, and this is a bit more a philosophical question. You're saying this dynamic we see in Lebanon is being played out all across the Middle East. We see it, of course, in this region as well, in our country, also, in many ways divided according to ethnic configurations that play out in political parties and such. I want to ask you, is Lebanon in any way kind of trapped? Is in fact any shift of the compact, the troika that was allowed to rule after the Civil War that ended in 1990, would shifting that actually destabilize Lebanon? And could anybody afford to have a destabilized Lebanon?
Yeah. So, I mean, the system that you have in Lebanon has pretty much been in place for the last 30 years, and it's become somewhat frozen. So, I mean, we talk about, this sectarian system as, sort of becoming entrenched and leading to this kind of form of patronage and corruption and sort of disconnect between the elites and society. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, it could, the system could work much more efficiently and much more effectively, if the political parties were more sort of responsive to society. There is nothing that means that, sectarianism has to lead to bad governance. I mean, here, for example, here in Belgium, we have, a split between, sort of Flemish speakers on one side and French speakers on the other, and yet they somehow managed to get the system to work together.
Well, On that note, then going forward, what should we be mindful as the international community watching this? Bearing in mind that perhaps the next government in Lebanon will likely be negotiated within the parliaments rather than formed through fresh elections. What should we be mindful of, Guy?
Yeah. So I think what's going to be important is, as I sort of flagged up about the international community, making sure that, that whatever government emerges, does, follow through on, dealing with a proper inquiry into what happened in the blast, but also, providing support to, to societal demands that, an improvement in sort of the Lebanese way of life, can be affected. But that also means, sort of taking into account the sheer complexity that is Lebanon today. There is no one single, solution to what's going on in Lebanon. It's a political crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a refugee crisis, and all of this stuff is brewing. I mean, the one thing you can say about the blast is that it has drawn a lot more international attention to something that we've been following, as Middle East specialists for the last, at least for the last 9-10 months.
Right, Guy, could you help us just understand that apparently there are two contenders now, Nawaf Salam, an ex-jurist, and also Mohammed Basiri, formerly with the Lebanon Central Bank. These seem to be the two contenders in the race. Is that what you think? And could any of these men actually achieve something that the former government failed to do?
Well, I mean, not speaking specifically to those two individuals, I mean, they do sound somewhat like, sort of technocrats in the sense of that they come from, sort of economic specialist areas. I mean, this is one of the challenges because the previous government was, supposedly a technocratic government rather than a one based on political parties. But of course, that technocratic government was one that was put forward by the political parties, by the political class as kind of a shadow for them. So in that sense, there is going to be this big problem moving forward. To what extent is government actually fully going to represent and reflect, to the demands that are taking place within society? And I must say this: there is a real anger, in Lebanon from people I've spoken to after last week. There was anger already, but I think the blast, exposes, in a way, it's somewhat of a metaphor. It exposes, the incompetence. It exposes, sort of the poor governance. The failure to sort of, to look after, the country's people.
Well, okay, a final, very quick response from you. How democratic is Lebanon? Is that democratic culture helping, produce alternative visions of that country?
Well, so yeah, so there is. I mean, compared to many of the other countries in the region, Lebanon does have elections. And periodically, that this does. But the problem is that there is the system doesn't really allow for, considerable variation. I mean, you have seen some change take place over the last 30 years, but it's a very sort of incremental rather than sort of substantial. It's an incremental change rather than a massive sort of revolutionary change. And what you're seeing is kind of a clashing together of a typical way of working that has been the way that the political classes and the parties have done in the past with what people on the ground are demanding. The difficulty, as I sort of flagged up, is trying to sort of create a coherent, new organisation and set of demands that can be reflected, right, by the protest movement. But certainly you are seeing some change happening on the ground. Whether it can sort of feed through into the political system is what we're going to be having to watch for.
Okay, well, definitely going to be keeping a very close eye on the situation in Lebanon. Guy, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight and helping us understand the complex situation there. Thanks for your time. That's all we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night. Thank you.